Zechariah chapter 9 is where we're picking up. We are done reviewing now. Now we move into new stuff, okay? Zechariah chapter 9 begins with the burden of the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach, with Damascus as its resting place, for the eyes of men, especially all of all the tribes of Israel, are toward the Lord. And Hamath also, which borders on it, Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise. For Tyre built herself a fortress and piled up silver like dust and gold like the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will dispossess her and cast her wealth into the sea, and she will be consumed with fire. Ashkelon will see it and be afraid. Gaza, too, will writhe in pain. Ekron, for her expectation has been confounded. Moreover, the king will perish from Gaza, and Ashkelon will not be inhabited, and a mongrel race will dwell in Ashdod. And I will cut off the pride of the Philistines, and I will remove their blood from their mouth, and their detestable things from between their teeth. Then they also will be a remnant for our God, and be like a clan in Judah, and Ekron like a Jebusite. There's a couple of stages that go on here. Now, I can give you some background to this. I can give you a lot of historical background to this, but here's what I want you to see. There are 5 pronouncements in chapter 9, okay? The first pronouncement, the passage makes a pronouncement to a world power in verses 1 through 4, to a world power. What world power? Specifically, Syria. There's a lot of background we could do here, but for our purposes, I just want to say it's a pronouncement against Syria. And in verses 5, 6, and 7, there's a second pronouncement, and that's to the allies of the world power, particularly the Philistines. So 1 through 4, pronouncement against a world power. 5 through 7, pronouncement against allies of that world power. And then there's a passage in verse 8 that is a pronouncement to Jerusalem concerning God's protection of his temple in 9:8. That's the third pronouncement. Then there's a passage to anticipating followers of a coming king in Judah. That's 9 through 12. And that's where you're going to see a shadow of Messiah's first advent coming. This is a passage made to anticipating followers that are waiting on God to do something. So, starts with Syria, moves to the allies of Syria, then to Jerusalem. I'm going to protect you. How are you going to protect us? Let me make a pronouncement about a coming ruler who will become emerging your protection. And then in verses 13 through 17, a passage that is about a rising star, a country named Greece that wasn't yet even much a thing. But already, I mean, it was a thing in terms of its classical period, but not in terms of international dominance. The Greeks were busy sitting in Periclean Athens and creating classical Athens. They were not marching off to try and take over Philistine territories or the world of the East. So the last pronouncement was about Greece and a rising star, a fellow by the name of Al, who was going to take over the known world in 333, and this is long before that. This is 500. That's lower 300s. Nearly 170 years after this is written down, 190 years after this is written down, Greece will be a thing, Alexander will be a thing, and then Alexander will rise and drop, and then the Diadoche, or the generals that take over his territory, will be a thing, and they're all in chapter 9. In other words, expect this. Syria, this world power, I'm going to bring them down. Expect this. Allies of a world power, Philistines and other allies, I'm going to bring them down. Jerusalem, you've already been brought down. You're rebuilding. I will protect you. The fourth one, get ready, because here I come. There's going to be a Messiah ruler that comes to Judah. Oh, wait, not yet. 13 to 17. First, there's a guy named Al going to pay you a visit as I set up the coming of Messiah. That's how the flow of the passage is. Now, the part we read in verses 1 through 7, can I take a different approach? That's the history. Can I take a personal approach on this? Because I want you to be able to use the verses personally, principally, not only historically and literally. I believe in the history. I think he's telling history, and I'll tell you the history as I get to it. But I want you to look at those first 7 verses, and I want you to consider that in your darkened life, you followed the course of this world. I want to come back to you for a minute. There was a time in your life before you knew God where you followed the course of this world. Now, for some of you, you came to Christ at 5. So don't look for anything deep in the first 5 years. But you didn't know God. For some of you, it was last year. And so there was a darkness as you followed the course of the world. And you trust in wealth, you trust in wisdom, you trust in strength, you trust in experts, you trust in psychology, you trust in science, you trust in a whole plethora of other things, but not God. And you thought in your lostness the people that were wealthy had it made. It just made sense to you. There were people who had it made because they were wealthy. And the people that were knowledgeable were going places. And the people that were building up a life, they were all the rage. I want to be like that celebrity or that wealthy person or that smart person. You looked at life like people looked at Syria as a world power and said, might must mean they're right. Or allies, look at those guys. They're doing well. They're building for themselves. Look at Tyre as it built up and had all this gold and it became something. And so the first 7 verses principally are like this. People that begin in darkness and are surrounded by darkness evaluate things improperly. So the first 7 verses set up the 2 pronouncements, a world power, Syria, and the second pronouncement to the allies. But both of them are captured with this idea. In your darkened life, you don't evaluate things properly. People would look at Syria and think they were powerful and look at Tyre and think they were rich. And God was about to step in and turn Tyre into a broken down place and to break the back of Syria and bring in stronger powers like, for instance, Greece, that were going to clean their clock. Everybody's powerful until somebody's stronger. Everybody's a champion until the other champion comes and beats them. So here's what he's saying. In the first 7 verses, when you look back on your dark life, you're going to realize that you evaluated life stupidly. And by the way, you're going to look around at a lot of unsaved people, and they're going to walk around going, well, obviously they're right because they're rich. How does that work? You are already aware by this point in your study of the Word that you can be absolutely successful in this life and a failure in real life. Because real life is what matters in 100 million years. Real life is what matters in the eternal, not what matters in the temporal. There are people who are gorgeous for 20 years of this temporal life. But it doesn't mean that they're beautiful in spirit. And so you can't judge internal things by external views. Okay, then you get down to verse 8 and 8 through 12, and remember that we're still in the historical frame. 8 is about the pronouncement to protect Judah, and 9 through 12 is a foreshadowing of the coming of Messiah. So watch closely what he says. I will camp around my house. Where's my house? God is speaking. Where's my house? Temple. So and what city is that in? Jerusalem. So I will camp around the temple in Jerusalem because of an army, because of him who passes by and returns, and no oppressor will pass over them anymore, for now I have seen with my eyes. So God says, I'm going to put a little cup of my hand over top of Jerusalem, and people are going to go walking through and tear down all kinds of cities, but that one's not going to get torn down. Why? Because I took a look at it and I want to rebuild it, and I just sent out a bunch of angels to measure it, and I got stuff I'm doing, and nobody's touching what I'm doing. So God says, I may move the world politics all around, but when I say this spot you can't touch, they can't touch that spot. Then you get to verses 9 through 12. Now you're going to see these verses in the New Testament, because these are foreshadowing of the first coming of Christ. It says in 9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. So who's the king of Jerusalem? Who's the prophetic king of Jerusalem? Who's the one who will sit on David's throne? Messiah. And so Messiah is going to come, and rejoice, daughter of Zion, because Messiah is coming. And then he says this, he is just and endowed with salvation. So he is a righteous and just one, but he will bring rescue. Well, wait a minute. You just said God's going to protect us. Yes, he's going to bring rescue. They don't know when they read rescue that this isn't about temporal rescue of a metallic kingdom with a sword. This looks to them like Jerusalem's going to be in trouble, but then the Messiah is going to come and rescue us militarily. That's not what he's saying. On this side of the cross, what was he saying? What's that? Messiah is going to come. He's going to rescue you from your sin. But that's not clear in the passage. You know what they didn't because you are later than them. Okay? Now take a look at what he says is, but he's going to come and be humble. Humble? Mounted on a donkey. What does a king ride on? A horse. Who rides on a donkey? Servants, right? So he's going to come in like Jesus is going to come like a servant. So Zechariah 9:9 is when he sends Peter and John to go to the village against the hill, he says, get me a donkey. I'm riding in on a donkey. Why? Because the Messiah was promised to ride in on a donkey. The triumphal entry on Palm Sunday, Jesus was on a donkey. Normally, he was on foot. Why did he come on a donkey? Because there was a prophecy that said when he came, he would come on the young donkey. And so it says, even a colt, the foal of a donkey. By the way, it's not two donkeys, it's one donkey. It's a young donkey. So he comes on one, in other words, that can be bought cheaply. He goes to rent a wreck and gets a wreck and comes in on a cheap wreck rather than on a grand float. He's not coming in a Rolls, he's coming in a broken Volkswagen van. Why? Because he's humble. So when he comes, he's a king, but he comes humbly. And that's weird. And you should mark out that when God gave the prophecy, it was already weird. They should have been saying, wait a minute, why is our king that's coming with rescue coming on a rent-a-wreck? That doesn't make any sense. Now, he goes on in verse 10, I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of war will be cut off. He will speak peace to the nations, and his dominion will be from sea to sea, and from river to the ends of the earth, deliverance of Judah and Ephraim. As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I have set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Return to the stronghold, O prisoners who have the rope. This is the very day I am declaring that I will restore double to you. Okay, is anybody lost? You should be. This is really hard. But right in the middle of his humility comes a statement of the world being dominated by him. How does that work? He comes in on a donkey and then he says, I'm going to cut off Ephraim, that is the territory of the north. I'm going to cut off the horses from Jerusalem. I'm going to cut off the bow and the warriors, and he's going to come in and speak peace. When does the Messiah speak peace? Okay, spiritually he did in his first coming, but physically he will in his second coming. In his second coming in Revelation 19, and I'd write that next to it in Revelation 19, he comes through the clouds and he speaks and mows down the warfare of men, which seems to be what he's saying here. Could you possibly, as a Jew at the time of Zechariah, have separated between verse 9 and verse 10 and know that those are two different comings? No, you couldn't have. Nick says no. Do you all agree with him? Is Nick right? Is it pretty impossible to tell the difference between his first coming and second coming in 9 and 10? I think Nick is right, and I think it's the reason why Jewish people say Jesus came, but he didn't do all that stuff. Because it looks like it's one thing, but it's not. This is a prophecy like we've seen over and over and over. There are often double bounces in prophecy. There's a spiritual truth and there's a physical truth. Here, he comes on a donkey. He comes to bring rescue. The rescue is effected in the first coming spiritually, but not in physical peace until he comes again in Revelation 19. So you see both of them tied into the imagery here. But again, it's sketchy. It's hard to know. If I were a person who did not believe in the literal return of Jesus, I would turn verse 10 into a spiritual thing. Well, he brought peace in my heart. He brought peace to the hearts of people. I'm not saying that he didn't. I'm saying that I think that falls short. I think if verse 9 was a literal donkey, then verse 10 is literal peace. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying if you're going to go literal on the first advent but not on the second, you got a problem with how you're doing Scripture. What justifies that? To be consistent, I would rather say, well, if it says he's coming, then I guess he's coming. Because if that's not what he means, I don't know what he means when he says he's coming. Okay? Now, let me personalize this. Let me move from the history and move from, by the way, I should finish off verse 11. What's verse 11 about? As for you also. Who? Who's the you in the passage? Jewish people. As for you Jews also, because of the blood of my covenant with you. What is the blood of my covenant? What's the blood of the Jewish covenant? Circumcision. That's where you sign on to the blood of the covenant, right? And he says, because I have a covenant with you that I will be your God and you'll be my people, I have set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Meaning, I have ordered a future time for salvation for your people. They will be saved. Not right then, but I've ordered it. I put in an order for salvation for your people. It's not happening today. It won't happen for a long time, but it'll happen. Why? Because I put the order in, and when I put an order in, it gets done. And by verse 12, return to the stronghold, O prisoners, who have the hope. This very day I am declaring that I will restore double to you. If you will believe what I'm saying is true and follow me, I will restore your people. I've promised to do so. Now, let me personalize that. In the first 7 verses, I suggested to you that there was a time of darkness in your life. There was a time when you walked in darkness and you thought that the world could be measured by who was rich and who was powerful, and that was how you measured the world. You get down to verse 8, and God moves in verses 8 through 12. And you experience the touch of God. And Jesus came and he camps inside your heart, and you don't have to fight all your battles alone because you know the Master. And the one who came as a servant has also been enthroned in your heart. Let me use it as an image. Jesus comes through the cross serving us, dying for us. He doesn't come bombastically to reign over us. He does reign over us, but he comes by serving right into our heart. And when he comes into our heart and he serves his way in, your fight with God is over and your fight for God just begins. You switch sides from fighting God to fighting for God. When you surrender to him, you become part of his team. And it's interesting because that peace that you strive for in the world becomes part of your life when you understand how you get it. All of a sudden, the real world opens to you and you understand peace isn't a here and now thing. You can be in turmoil in this life and at peace with God. If you don't know that, there will come times in your life when you will be at turmoil in this world. But you'll find that you're able to go to him and say, God, you've promised me to be my all in all. Let me rest in you in the middle of this storm. Now, let's get down to the third stage, because the first stage was darkness. The second stage in 8 through 12 looks to me like God breaking into my mess. Okay? Let me go to the third stage, God fighting for his people. And somebody read verses 13 through 17. Nice and loud.
For I will bend Judah as my bow. I will fill the bow of Ephraim, and I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and I will make you like a warrior's sword. Then the Lord will appear over them, and his arrow will go forth like lightning, and the Lord God will blow the trumpet, and will march in the storm winds of the south. The Lord of hosts will defend them, and they will devour and trample on the sling stones, and they will drink and be boisterous as with wine. And they will be filled with like a sacrificial basin, drenched like the corners of the altar. And the Lord their God will save them in that day, as the flock of his people. For they are as the stones of a crown sparkling in his land. For what comeliness and beauty will be theirs. Grain will make the young men flourish, and new wine the virgins.
Don't miss that there's a real excitement in this passage, that God uses the word Greece and says Greece is going to be coming to you. It's 190 years before Greece is coming anywhere near them. So when somebody looks at you and says, where's a prophecy you can verify historically? We have a copy of Zechariah from before the time of Jesus. And we have a copy of the predicted prophecy of the coming of these world powers like Greece that is given 190 years before Greece is a thing. It's almost like me saying, and there will come about a president in that day. His name will be Fred Jones. 100 years before there is a Fred Jones, and he becomes president. This is historically a pinnable thing. Just remember, when somebody sits and looks at you and says, how do we know that Christianity and the Bible is true? Remind them that the words of Muhammad cannot be tested historically. The words of Buddha cannot be tested historically. The words of the Hindu faith, the words of the Sikhs cannot be tested historically. The only one of the major religions that has a historical setting that can be checked and cross-checked with actual verifiable history is the Judeo-Christian, the Bible. It's the only book like it. So when people are trying to say, well, there's lots of world religions, yes, and there's no way to check what they're saying. But when you look at the Bible, it has historically verifiable prophetic material in it. And this is one of those places. It says, I want you to know that there's going to come these people named Greece, and they're going to come and sweep across the world, and they're going to take it over. But I'm going to raise up some Jews on a hillside, and they're going to get an attitude and go, we're fighting for God, and I'm going to make them victorious. When did that occur? What story comes from Jews fighting Greeks that becomes a holiday? Softball, come on. Seriously. Yes, okay, who said it?
I did, Mrs. Bell.
Thank you, yeah. Okay? Yeah, all right. Hey, listen, you just had the intervention of a friend. There you go. All right, so during that period between Malachi and Matthew, Greece becomes a thing. 333 BC, Alexander the Great sweeps across the world, and by 323 he's dead, but he's taken over the whole known Western world. But after that, remember, Syria gets the Seleucids, Ptolemies are in Egypt. The Ptolemies get the Holy Land for a time. The Seleucids get uppity, and from Syria, from Damascus, which we've been reading about, they get uppity and come down and try to bump in and take over the temple of God. And the Maccabi revolt. Maccabees is the English, the Hebrew is Maccabi. Okay? It's also the famous beer of Israel. But Maccabees, it means a hammer, and it's because when Judah the Maccabi went out, he went out doing this, which looks more like an Atlanta Braves fan. But he didn't know about the Atlanta Braves yet. That comes later. At any rate, he goes out like this, and they become known as the Hammer Guys. That is the Maccabees, or Maccabees. And that time period, what holiday comes out of that for Jews? Hanukkah comes out of that. Seriously, it comes out of that time period because although Antiochus, the Seleucid ruler, comes and tries to defile the temple, God keeps the oil burning in the lamps over the period until they can relight the altar and the consecrated oil. The fire of the altar didn't go out. It went out on the altar, but it was on the lamp and then came back. Same fire, same oil. And so as a result, God miraculously kept the oil of the lamps burning, and that was the Hanukkah period. So let me step back and say, following our line of thinking personally, you were in darkness, 1 through 7. God broke in, 8 through 12. Stage 3, 13 to 17, is, and then God starts fighting for his people. When you get on God's side, remember, God is for you when you are for God. So when you step into his surrender to him and say, God, I am ready to follow you, you just got an armor the size and likes of which you have never seen. Let me say it this way. You are absolutely 100% indestructible when doing what God told you to do until God is done with you. You absolutely are. You have better than a man of steel, better than a shield around you. You, O Lord, are the shield around me. And that happens when you're doing what God called you to do. Now here's the problem. When you're not, you're shieldless. Okay? The most dangerous place for a believer to be is anywhere God didn't tell you to be. doing anything God didn't tell you to be doing. Why is it dangerous? Because you are wide open to the enemy on every side and you are unprotected. Roman soldiers had armor that was closed in the front but had nothing in the back. That way they knew not to run away. If you turn around and run, you're dead. Okay? Your enemy will kill you for us. We won't have to court-martial you. You'll be dead on the field with an arrow in your back. So if you're going to run, learn to run backwards because, which means you're going to fall down and then you're going to be dead. So the whole idea was that they did it on purpose. For God, it's even more pronounced than this. Your shields fall off when you walk in disobedience. So the wounds that you can take on from disobedience are not just a consequence of your direct disobedience. They're also a consequence of the firefight that you're in the middle of. It's almost like you're hiding behind a really good sandbag wall when you're in obedience to the Lord. And when you decide not to be in obedience, you walk out from the sandbag wall and you're standing in the middle of the field wide open. So when you get hit, no, it wasn't because God was mad at you, it's because you got out from behind the wall. Obedience is living in the protection of the shield of God. Disobedience is standing out in the field without that protection. It's not that God is mad at you, it's that you left the protection. So in a very real sense, that's what we call the wrath of God. The wrath of God is, I left the consistency of His faithful protection to do what He told me not to do. And there's a consequence that goes with living in a firefight without an armor protector. Okay? So the battle gets joined, and I can have peace with God, but my enemy is raging against my hometown. He's raging against my master's name. He's raging against everything that he stands for. He's in opposition to all of it. And when you get down to verses 14 and 15, that he is just coming at us, and God has to give us strength to get through. Zechariah is the perfect one to tell us that because he can see the other side of the battle. He can peer through the curtain. Now get down to verses 16 and 17. Okay, prophetically speaking, God says, I'm going to save my people, which he does in the coming of Messiah. He doesn't save them all at one time. He doesn't save them all the same way, but he does save them. But look at that stage 4 as God's salvation. And let me just say it this way. The enemy can threaten, but he cannot deliver if you're walking with God. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. He does not have access to you. He does not have power over you. If you walk in obedience, you will not be subject to his power unless God signed off on it, and then it's okay. It may hurt, but it'll be okay because God signed off on it because he knew what was best. The believer has to keep his focus on the Lord because that's where the enduring promises are upheld for us. All right, that's chapter 9. And the 4 stages are as simple as you walked in darkness, you were surrounded in darkness, verses 1 to 7. God broke into the mess, verses 8 through 12. God picked up the fight for his people in verse 13 down to verse 17. And during that whole time, he saved his people in 16 and 17 specifically and delivered a salvation. And the point that I'm trying to make is there's a historical setting for Israel, but there's also a literal setting, a principled setting that works in your life as well. These same principles are given to you for something else, okay? When you get to chapter 10, God warned his people to avoid a dead end. Because the prophetic story of the God's plan for Israel, a few years had passed since they started working on the second temple, and one generation had seen it operate and its modest size and the vassal relationship they had to a world power. Babylon wore a rut in the heart of the people of Israel, and they were like feeling like, wow, the great days of Solomon and David are over. They were long ago. The prophets rose and brought us hope. But now all we got is this dinky little temple and we're this backwater. We used to be a power. We used to be a thing. Look at us now. This is like the elderly woman who used to be beautiful sitting in front of a mirror going, it's not going to happen anymore. And there's a disappointment in the background. The interesting thing is, God wants to get up and do something and fight for this people. So Israel was in need of a realignment with the majesty of God. I want to stop and I want to introduce a concept even this point in the year that we really haven't talked much about. God's majesty is a buoyancy in our lives. This doesn't sound like it'll work, and you're going to look at me like this doesn't work. It works. You're going to have to hear it first and then try it later. When you're discouraged about you, look at him. There's a buoyancy in understanding the majesty of God. I have found in my own life when I'm discouraged, I start looking at Psalms that describe who God is. Lift your eyes up off of who you are and forget who you are and start remembering whose you are. Because there's a buoyancy in knowing that you... Let me even go a step further. Ladies, at some point in your life, you'll have your 3 children, you'll be working like all get out to try and keep a house clean, and you will be wondering what the significance of your life is. At some point, this will happen to you. If this happens to you, turn and look at who God is who made you. And there's a reason why I say this. He's going to help you to understand that who you are in the life of your children will make you rise. That because of relationship you rise. And with God, my relationship with him is what draws me up to a higher place. You can get so caught up in a Grand Canyon of self-esteem where you're like, and you're looking around and there's just tall walls all around you and you don't feel like you measure up. But if you take a moment and you look at Zechariah 10, there's some instructions that a believer can use to avoid a dead end and avoid being down in that pit. So there's an encouragement involved here. Now, we need to be careful not to be so anxious to apply God's word that we torque it out of its context and forget what it's saying. The passage is to Israel and about Israel. So look at the breakdown of the text. God told people to call out to him now that the time of the spring rain, that is the end of the grain harvest, was ready. And the prophets used the term latter rain for end times. So God wanted the Jewish people that were demoralized to go ahead and ask him to bring out the latter rains he promised. Look at verse 1. Somebody read it nice and loud.
Ask rain from the Lord at the time of the spring rain, the Lord who makes the storm clouds, and he will give them the showers of rain, vegetation in the field to each man.
So he opens up and says, all right, ask God to bring out the harvest of the latter times. They needed to put away any false sources of information. You must understand that the most dangerous thing to the enemy is truth. He is a father of lies, so the most dangerous thing is truth. It is the reason he will hinder you from learning truth. It is the reason he will help you to forget truth when you learn it. He will do everything he can to keep you from the truth and trick you into a lie. He will get you to believe that you are not who God says you are, that your identity is something else, because he is a deceiver. That's what he does. Now look at this. In verse 1, it says, you got to change where you're getting your information and turn around and ask God to do in latter times what he promised. They needed to put off the false ideas and false information in verses 2 and 3 and only go to be judged falsely what God says is false, and truth is what God says it is. Let me say it this way. Things are not as they appear. They're as God says they are. They are not as they appear. Rich people aren't rich. Okay? Celebrities aren't famous. Because 100 million years from now, you'll say, celebrity who? Rich what? Real things are eternal things. Temporal things are temporal. They come and they go. The grass withers, the flower fades. It's a beautiful flower until it's not. She's a model until she's an old lady. Okay? They don't last. Put your trust in the things that don't last, and your trust will fade when the things that don't last fade. Put your trust in the eternal things, and you will find them eternally satisfying and great. So, verse 5 says, a Messiah will come from you. Do you see it? Somebody read verse 5 nice and loud.
They will be as mighty men, trading down the enemy in the mire of the streets in battle, and they will fight, for the Lord will be with them, and the riders on horses will be put to shame.
So, the Lord will be with them is the operative phrase as to why they are what they are. They are powerful because the Lord is with them. Power and strength come from the hand of the Lord. They come from the presence of the Lord. You don't have authority of your own. You have borrowed authority. When you stand up to the enemy, it's always the Lord rebuke you, not I rebuke you. You don't rebuke anybody. You're lower than angels. He's bigger than you. You have exactly you on your team. He has a myriad of demonic angels. So you versus him is going to be a non-starter, okay? However, the Lord rebuke you. I stand in the name of the Lord is with me. That changes the whole equation, because greater is he that is in you. Verse 6 says that a fighting force is going to be raised up that's going to drive others more equipped away as they are restored to their former land. Verse 7 says they're going to dance in the streets over the return. Verse 8 says, I'll continually pull them up home in waves to the land, and the land will start to be huge again. He's talking to Israel. He's talking about Israel, but he's saying something more. Watch what he's saying. Verse 9, though they're sown into the nations, they're going to remain distinct and they're going to return unique. I'm going to scatter the Jewish people, but I'm going to keep them Jewish people, and they're going to come back as Jewish people. How did he do that, by the way? What kept Jews distinct from the rest of the world? Persecution. Here's the interesting thing. Satan persecuted Jewish people and in a way kept them together. His desire to annihilate them is what kept them together. What's the greater threat now? It's Balaam and Balak. It's intermarriage. What he's doing in Israel now is he's pulling away hearts of people into other nations, which waters down and changes who they are. The point is the enemy only has a couple tricks up his sleeve. When one doesn't work, he throws the other one. Verse 10, they're going to come from many lands until they are stuffed into a small land. Do you see it? This is a set of promises about a return of a people to the land. Somebody read 10 through 12.
I will bring them back from the land of Egypt and gather them from Assyria, and I will bring them back into the land of Gilead and Lebanon until no room can be found for them. And they will pass through the sea of distress, and he will strike the waves in the sea, so that all the depths of the Nile will dry up, and the pride of Assyria will be brought down, and the scepter of Egypt will depart. And I will strengthen them in the Lord, and in his name they will walk, declares the Lord.
Okay, do you understand that the process here is that a Messiah will come and walk with you in verse 5, but a tribulation will come in verse 11. That they're going to come back into the land in verse 10, but a tribulation will come in verse 11. Do you see the order of the events? Messiah comes, a fighting force comes, they dance in the streets, they're coming back into the land, but they don't have God's heart yet. Would you say, well, God is with them? Yes, but they don't have God's heart. They're not with God. God is working a plan in spite of them. So that's why in verse 10, they'll come and be stuffed into the land. That is physically restored to the land. But in verse 11, they have to go through the sea of trouble. Why do they have to go through a sea of trouble? Because a tribulation is what brings their heart. They physically return to the land, then there's a tribulation, then their hearts become his. Where are we right now? They're physically returning to the land, but they haven't yet gone through tribulation, and their heart is not his. Expect Israel to be growing by leaps and bounds physically, but to have the largest gay pride parade in all of the nations of that region. In other words, they're coming back, they're wealthy, they're smart, they're building, and their heart doesn't belong to God yet, but it will. And when you get to verse 12, I will renew them and they will walk in Messiah's name. But the renewal doesn't happen till after the return. Someplace make a note between verses 10 and 11 and 12 on the side that the promise was Jews would return and then be renewed. It's exactly what you see in Jeremiah 31 and Isaiah 59. They come back, but they come back as people whose heart is not for God, though God's heart is for them, and then God changes their heart. The heart doesn't change until after their feet change. They get back in the land, then they get a new God. All right, now, step back on 10. We just told you a story about Jewish people. Now I want to move it to, how do I apply this? What do I do with it? Because God didn't make a promise that I'm going to retake New Jersey, okay? This is for them and where they are. But there are principles behind here. Step back and look at verse 10. Verse 1, in chapter 10. God's people should seek him confidently concerning their future. That's a principle that you can apply to you as much as to them. God has the power and God has the plan, but he's made it so that his people can participate. What you need to do is understand God has a plan. The question is not, is the Spirit moving? The question is, do I have my sails up so the wind of the Spirit's blowing me? That's the question. He's going somewhere. The question is, are you in it? And I want to be in it. He alone has the might of the heavens. He alone will bring the planned end, the latter rains, the grain harvest. He's the only one who can do what he says. The second thing I would tell you is in verse 2. People should avoid the traps of false information. The teraphim speak iniquity. Those are false gods, superstitious false gods. Diviners see lying visions. Those are experts who are seeing things, looking into the spiritual world, but they're looking into the dark world. They tell false dreams. They comfort in vain. Right now, people in churches are standing up and saying, come to Jesus because it's all about getting well. It's all about getting healthy. They're lying. They got this much Jesus truth and this much garbage. And they're tying it together so that people come to Jesus expecting to get healed, don't get out of their wheelchair, and think Jesus lied. That's the game plan. So you got to get your information from the right people. Verse 2 is people have to avoid the traps of false information. Even religious false information. Let me say it this way. More people are moved away from God because of false religion than anything else. It's not bad things that move people from God. It's, quote, good things that aren't God things that move people away. So you get down to verse 3, and here's another one of these principles. God's people should not follow self-appointed sources. Verse 3, my anger is kindled against the shepherds. I'm going to punish the male goats. Okay, here's what I need you to see. Sheep follow shepherds or goats. In the absence of a good shepherd, they'll follow a goat. And so he says, I'm angry with the shepherds because they're not standing up and dealing with the false things that are being said. And I'm going to punish the male goats because they're leading my people astray. Let me say it another way. The enemy plants liars and lies. That's what he does. And for an added measure of confusion, some people appoint themselves as the confusion grows to be the seers of truth. They want to help, but they have neither the call nor the makeup of a true shepherd. They're goats. So what they do is start something that they think is going to help, but it doesn't help because it distracts from what's real. I'm going to say something some of you probably aren't going to agree with, and that's really okay with me, but many times in my life I've seen ministries started up that are parachurch ministries that try to take the place of the church without the apparatus of the church's inspection processes. So people that can't work within a church will go down the street and they can't work within a youth ministry of a church where they have to be accountable, so they'll go and start a youth ministry with its own shingle and hang it out there and not be accountable. And here's the thing. Jesus didn't start 5 things. He started 1. Okay? Now, I'm not trying to tell you that parachurches are all wrong. What I'm trying to tell you is be careful when we set up something that is designed to do what the church was designed to do without the accountability and structure of the church. Be careful, okay? Because it's easy to get caught up. And what I think happens is many times people that are goats look like shepherds. I think that's what I'm trying to say. All right, get down to, keep reading in verse 3, and what it says is that God's people should watch his unfolding plan closely. You need to keep an eye on what God is doing. So it says, the Lord of hosts has visited his flock, the house of Judah, and will make them like his majestic horse in battle. You need to keep your eyes on what God is doing, how God is changing people, what God is putting strength into. Because very often there's a plan that men devise, and they think that's how things get done. But it's not by power, and it's not by might. God injects his Spirit and empowers things that men do not understand. That's why I get behind people that sometimes you're going to scratch your head and go, why would he get behind that guy? I have some friends in missions that honestly look like they're a mess. But if you watch them on the mission field, God empowers them. And you sit and talk with them and you think, they're the weirdest people. Yes, here, but down there, they're unbelievable people because God empowers what they're doing. I want to stop and just say this. Your ministry and its success is not based on your ability. It's based on your surrender and God's ability. And if you try to make it based on your ability, it will only go as far as you can take it. But if you base it on God's ability to work through you in spite of you, and you surrender who you are, He will take you further than you could go. He'll pick a better spouse than you could pick. He will give you a better life than you could have. You will be much more content when you're following what God told you to do. And if you don't believe me, all you need to do is look at my life and know that I go places nobody gets to go and do things nobody gets to do, and I don't have anything, and I have everything. Okay? And someday I might have to work a real job. But for today, let's get back to this. Verse 6 and 7. Let me just add this thought. God's people have to trust His word more than what they see in the present world. If the people of God look at the situation with their fleshly eyes, they're not going to see what God said is true. But they have to see the God of the impossible. They have to trust that He's going to deliver and restore and have intimacy and blessing beyond what they can even recognize. He says, I'm going to strengthen the house of Judah. If you were sitting there at the time of Zechariah and you looked around Jerusalem, what strength? We don't even have walls. Because God said, I'm going to strengthen them. God said, I'm going to do it. So we have to be able to see beyond what... Guys, I've said it to you before, I'll say it to you again. When you look at the team you're going to be called to minister with, you're going to see everything that's wrong with them and nothing that's right in the flesh. You got to look past that. Because that stupid guy that you have to minister with actually is a gifted person, and the Spirit of God can use him incredibly. Yeah, they're a little weird, but God can really use them. God's people have to move at His command. And verses 8, 9, and 10, God's people have to move at His command and be set free from the captor. He says, I will whistle for them to gather them together, for I have redeemed them, and they will be as numerous as they were before. Now, this is a call. Obviously, it's a historical call of the Jews back to the land. But there's another factor here, and that is when God calls, people get drawn together. The size is going to be considerable. Separately, we're weak. Together, we're strong. In small pockets, the kingdom grew. You got to go back to the first century. You got to see what Paul saw. He walks into a town like Thessaloniki. He's only there for 2 weeks before he gets kicked out of town. And out of that, a church is raised up that becomes a foundational church for the second century. And it all happened in a couple of weeks with a couple of people in a villa somewhere on the edge of Thessaloniki. He goes to Berea, and there's a couple of people sitting there who are studying scrolls. It doesn't look like it's going to be some kind of mega church, but guess what? A couple people serious about God hear the gospel. They're changed, they're transformed, and God raises up a church there that exists for hundreds of years. You got to believe that God can do through you more than you can accomplish. You got to be able to see that He's not at the limit of what your ability is. And if you just look at the people, and you just look at the team, and you just look at the problems, and you just look at how bad is, and you just watch the news and sit there and let them tell you, it's getting worse, you're not going to see what God sees. God has a future. In chapter 10, God had a future for His people. But in your life, God has a future for you, and He has a future for the ministry that He's called you to. Until the trumpet sounds, you're not done yet. Do not stop running until you hit the tape. Don't stop running. They're going to tell you it's impossible. It's way too dark out there. I don't care. Keep running because you're not at the tape yet. Don't forget, Israel's the only nation in the world that had a land contract signed deed by God in Genesis 15. And He literally said He's going to restore the promises to that people. So just walk away from the end of the chapter with this. Take God's word seriously. What He promises He's going to do, He's going to do. If it takes thousands of years, that's what He's going to do. Don't discount, spiritualize, or wash away the truth of God. When He says, I'm bringing Jewish people back to the land, and then I'm going to put a new heart in them, and people go, well, these Jews, they don't have the heart of God. He didn't say He'd give them a new one until after they were back. So you can write down in your Bible and in your heart what God promises is going to happen. Now listen to me as I close chapter 10. God is moving the Jewish people back to the land. The UN hates it. The world court is against it. Islam has pledged its destruction because it's a denial of the Quran and an affirmation of the literal nature of biblical prophecy. Universities across this land that want to denigrate the Bible hate it. But make no mistake, we are on a collision course for the prophetic truth of the Word of the living God. When He says He's going to do it, He doesn't care if university professors agree with Him. He says, what I'm going to do, I'm going to do. He's not going to forsake them. He's not going to forget them. He's going to make sure that He keeps every promise. No army is going to stop them. No court is going to block them. No assembly is going to forbid them. No king is going to usurp them. What's going to happen is the world is going to go, no, 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 and they're going to keep being there. They're outnumbered 40-1 right now, and they're still there. Putin's got a bigger army. The North Koreans have more warheads. China's got a bigger army, and they're still there. Why? Because when He says He's going to do something, He's going to do it. And He's going to stand right in there. And the nations someday in Isaiah 11, the Arab nations around Israel are slated to bless the world. And Arab believers in the Lord Jesus Christ will bless the world, and they will love them. I think it's important for us to understand that we take comfort in the truth that not only for Israel, but for us as well, what God began to do in a work in us, He will perform until the day of Jesus Christ. Count on it. You can count on God's Word.